All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Generation 180 event, Biden's Electrifying First 100 Days. If you've joined us to hear how 3 federal agencies are working to accelerate the transition to transportation electrification, then you're in the right place. Next slide. Today, we're joined by the following federal government leaders: Dr. Rachael Nealer, Senior Advisor for Transportation at the U.S. Department of Energy; Andrew Wishnia, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at Department of Transportation; and Dr. Philip Fine, Principal Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Our panel today will provide a unique perspective on the steps taken to advance transportation electrification during President Biden's first 100 days and beyond. Next slide. Before we get started, I want to tell you briefly about Generation 180. We're a national nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia. We work to inspire and equip individuals to take action on clean energy. My name is Stuart Gardner, and I'm joined by my colleague Blair St. Ledger Olson. And a special thanks to our team members working behind the scenes to help support this event. Next slide. Here's a quick look at our 3 major focus areas of work. We're working to flip the energy script, helping us move from a narrative focused on climate doom and gloom to a story focused on where we need to go, a world powered by 100% clean energy, a story that says we can do this and we all have a role to play. We focus on individuals in their homes and their communities because your energy matters. Certain behaviors and technologies not only help fight climate change, but they also help to build the social momentum and political will we need to get big system level changes. We lead with 2 major nationwide campaigns, Solar for All Schools and Electrify Your Ride, which works to make EVs more accessible. Solar and EVs are clean energy solutions proven to address 2 of the largest sources of carbon dioxide: emissions from electricity generation and transportation. Next slide. All right, so a few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. Because of the number of people joining today, all event attendees will be on mute throughout the event. Please use a Q&A, not the chat, to submit your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can during the next hour. So without further ado, let's hear from our guests. Andrew, since you have to leave a little early today, would you like to kick us off and briefly introduce yourself?
Oh, sure, I'm happy to do so. So I'm Andrew Wishnia. As Stuart said, I'm Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy. And before I forget, let me just say what an honor it is to be here with Generation 180 and to be on a panel with Dr. Nealer and Dr. Fine. It's such an esteemed group, and Dr. Nealer and I probably talk to each other, at least daily, if not more. So it's fun to participate on a panel with her. But thank you so much. Thanks to Blair, and thanks for everyone listening in. I just wanted to sort of provide a bit of a topper by sharing a little of sort of what we're thinking about at the Department of Transportation. The president has indicated very clearly that he wants to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and so we're doing everything we can to achieve that. And part of what we're thinking about are options to reduce trips, shift trips, and improve trips, right? So by reducing trips, we're thinking about improved pedestrian infrastructure, improved bike infrastructure. Shifting trips, we're thinking about options to get folks out of single occupant vehicles, not require them, but to provide options for improving trips with less carbon intensive modes of transportation like transit and rail, and improving trips, and this goes to the conversation today, we're looking at not only road pricing, but transportation electrification and sort of a whole of government approach. What can we be doing in the federal government, not just at the Department of Transportation, but working with our key partners at the Department of Energy, EPA, Council on Environmental Quality, in all of the other agencies and entities that have equities in this space. So I'm really excited to be here. It's something that we're keenly focused on at DOT, and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Andrew. Rachael, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate being here and excited to talk about the future of electrification because I've been in the field for a while now, and we are at quite an opportunity in front of us. And so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it. And just like Andrew said, whole of government approach is what we are going to need in order to get there, to have that 2050 decarbonization. That includes transportation, right? We want 100% decarbonization of the transportation sector by 2050. And we're just going to have to do so in a coordinated way. DOE is really focused these days on the research, development, demonstration, and deployment of the technologies. So the transportation offices that I advise under the Deputy Assistant Secretary's Office for Transportation in the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office is the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technologies Office, the Bioenergy Technologies Office, and the Vehicle Technologies Office. So you can imagine what the Bioenergy and Fuel Cell Technologies Office work on. Vehicle Technologies is actually where our electrification program sits, as well as improving the efficiency of current vehicles through things like transportation system optimization, through our energy efficient mobility systems program, incorporating in some of the micromobility options, transit options, making sure that we're meeting people's mobility needs while also decarbonizing those modes. And so we also have a couple other Vehicle Technologies offices, a little bit of a catch-all of the various technologies that we work on if it's not bioenergy or hydrogen fuel cell related. So lightweight materials also plays a big piece there, and also kind of next generation of improving efficiency across various modes as well. So I'll leave it there for now. Looking forward to the questions. I'm sure we'll be able to dig into more detail of specifics by agency, but really excited to be here and really exercising the idea of this whole of government approach by sitting on a panel with great colleagues here. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Rachel. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself, round us out?
Sorry about that. I had to unmute and technical difficulties. Okay, yeah. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Philip Fine, and I am the Principal Deputy Associate Administrator at EPA in the Office of Policy. The Office of Policy deals with a lot of different subjects, but a lot of them are cross-agency issues, whether it's environmental justice, working with communities, working with industry, and managing some of the rulemaking processes that we have here at EPA. I started on January 20th, but before that I came from South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is a local air district in Southern California, and have a lot of experience trying to, lower basically criteria pollutant emissions, but obviously the benefits for greenhouse gas emissions are there as well. Most of my work was in the more the heavy duty sector, both on-road and off-road, and trying to get those emissions down and in many cases electrified. So one of the things I'm really looking forward to is, all the great things that have been happening in the light duty sector with electrifying vehicles, and how do we transfer that to on-road trucks, trains, freight, cargo handling equipment, and all those other sectors that are going to be a bigger piece of the pie of GHG emissions and other emissions as we go forward. I'm really pleased to be on the panel with my colleagues from DOT and DOE. The White House is very strong on interagency work and interagency collaboration, and we cannot do this in silos in our agencies. We've already started those collaborations. It's an all-of-government approach, as my colleagues mentioned, but it's also working together across the different agencies to leverage all our authorities, our funding, and our ideas. But in particular, our three agencies, EPA, DOT, and DOE, when it comes to decarbonizing transportation, are three of the key agencies, and we have already again started those interagency collaborations. At EPA, we have several roles to play here. Obviously, there's the regulations, the GHG standards for light duty and heavy duty, and moving into other sectors as well. But we also do have a lot of other work encouraging charging infrastructure, investing in communities, and then a large set of incentive programs that help deploy the cleaner technology, and moving some of those incentive programs towards zero emission or zero carbon emission technologies is something we're interested in. In terms of the standards, we do intend to have standards which will take advantage of this game-changing technology that's happening as we speak, and we want to push it not just in the light duty sector, but as I mentioned, to the other sectors as well. And the other important role EPA will play is, electrification of the power sector only benefits GHG to the extent that the grid is cleaner and zero emission as well. So obviously EPA is involved with efforts to clean the grid and clean power plants and get to more renewables and solar and wind and zero emission grid as well. And finally, I'll just mention that another important part of this conversation that's very important to the president is environmental justice and equity. So everything we do to encourage, regulate, incentivize electrification of transportation needs to have that in mind and make sure it's being done in an equitable manner.
Thank you so much. And you just ticked off like 6 of the questions that I had later on. So we are cruising along. Fantastic. So I think, Phil, you and Rachel, I think both touched upon what in particular your agencies are looking at. We're going to get back to those CAFE standards for sure. Andrew, this question is for you more so, looking at what the Department of Transportation is targeting in this transition, what specifically your agency is working on. And then as a follow-up for everyone, I would just like to ask what types of policies your respective agencies or rules are looking to implement that would impact this transition. So Andrew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the American Jobs Plan has kept us busy over the course of the past few months, both in sort of, helping, right, both in sort of helping craft the American Jobs Plan and in working with stakeholders, both on and off the Hill in figuring out program design. But, for the folks that are listening in, just in case people are not as intimately familiar with the program, it does have $174 billion of spend for EVs, and that includes, both EVs, charging infrastructure and incentives. And the thought there is really, whether we're talking about transit electrification, whether we're talking about highway charging, whether we're talking about EVs themselves, we want to promote a supply chain that encourages transportation electrification across the board and really does everything we can to, to hit our net zero by 2050 emissions. And a critical component of that is going to be transportation electrification. So at the Department of Transportation, I think we're going to be responsible for a pretty sizable share of operationalizing, various programs. And obviously we're going to need to work intimately with the Department of Energy, EPA, as we've already done. EPA and DOE just have enormous and unparalleled subject matter expertise, analytics, visualization tools, and folks really across the country who are prepared to understand not only the now, but the future in terms of prognosticating what does a national network actually mean, and how do you build out not just community charging, but corridor charging that meets the moment to respond to range anxiety, to gap fill across the highway system, and that can solve intermodal problems, both at ports, medium duty, heavy duty, light duty, and charging infrastructure needs, on and off the highway system. So Blair, that's what we've been doing. We've been sort of scoping what those programs look like, and we've been working on an interagency basis to work with our colleagues in operationalizing those programs when they come to pass.
That's great to hear. And it's like the three of you somehow know that our next question is, how do your agencies work together? All of you are psychic, I'm sure. Rachel, do you want to add anything? I think you touched upon a little bit the research and R&D that's happening over at DOE.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually DOE is a really good example of how the agencies work together. So DOE has lots of capabilities, particularly at the national labs. So we have 17 national labs across the US that are funded by DOE, and transportation uses a subset of those, but they have a lot of capabilities, including things like high performance computing, which are going to become more and more critical to how we develop and implement kind of science-based policy, right? So a large portion of what we do is fund about $800 million right now for transportation annually to the national labs and to individual performers through our funding opportunity announcements. So that can go directly to anyone kind of working in the space, whether it's universities, oftentimes, or companies, or people that are actually doing some of the demonstrations. Another good example is our Clean Cities coalitions, are ones that we have about 80 across the US that are really the kind of boots on the ground for DOE to get alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure out to communities. So we are kind of on the input side of good science-based policy. And so we're working very closely with DOT and EPA to make sure they have the information that they need, the research that kind of funnels into the policies, and the burden of proof that kind of goes along with the regulatory process.
That's great. Phil, is there anything you want to add to that about the EPA?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the interagency collaborations, I've only been in the federal government 4 months, but there's obvious synergies between what DOE and DOT are doing, obviously on the regulation side with DOT and EPA on the standards, but others as well. And I'll just mention, since I've been here, a lot of the conversations with DOE and DOT have been focused on how you could bring up how this can be done equitably, this transition, and how it can create jobs, and how we touch down in communities to help sort of the market acceptance of these technologies. So there's ongoing discussions there, as well as some discussion sort of more formally at the sort of interagency level at the White House. So yeah, those collaborations are key, and each of our agencies plays an important role. I mean, the technology that DOE helps develop allows us to do the regulations, right? And some of the infrastructure work that DOT does allows those regulations to take hold and be accepted. So yeah, but that coordination is key to success.
Thanks, Phil. Rachel, I think of the 3 panelists, you've probably been in your role or in your with your employer the longest. Can you share any insight about how maybe conversations around transportation electrification have changed over the recent time or over a period of the last few years? Any insight about working together and how that might change or has changed recently?
Yeah, so we've, like I said, we've got an $800 million research and development budget that we've had. It's the healthiest budget that we've ever had. And we've had that amount for quite a while now, a couple of years. And so we've been really chipping away at, a really good example is battery costs, right? So just a decade or so ago, battery costs were at about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. And now we're down to about $144 per kilowatt hour
wow.
rated energy there. And so DOE has been kind of instrumental in bringing those battery costs down, which then translates to lower costs for consumers when they purchase their vehicles. So we've been, what DOE is really good at is kind of developing a technical pathway to get to lower costs, which will be more affordable for consumers of all alternative fuels. So that's for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and biofuels as well. And it's not only on the light duty side either. Light duty is very ripe right now. The costs continue to come down. But what I think is really interesting and has happened in the last couple of years is that with those declining battery costs, we also see an increased appetite in the medium and heavy duty sector as well, which as technical expert, didn't really expect to see that coming so quickly. We were really thinking that hydrogen and fuel cell and biofuels might be a larger share of the medium and heavy duty market. They still are going to play a very key point or a key part, but electrification is I think a really good opportunity in the short term to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So hydrogen, you'd like to see the cost of delivered hydrogen to go down a little bit more in order to be more competitive. In biofuels, we really need to ramp up the scale of the biofuel production that we have. And so we really think that there is a kind of a strategic plan that comes to decarbonizing the full transportation sector by 2050. And it's going to include all the fuels, all the types of vehicles, because you also have to pull in things like rail and marine, which may be a little bit harder to electrify in certain applications. And so it's really targeting very specifically. I think we've done a good job of investigating many of these pathways, and now we're ready to kind of strategically buckle down and really get some demonstrations out there, some deployments. I think that's what's really exciting about where we are right now, is starting to prove out these technologies in the real world, so that we can really catalyze that path to full decarbonization by 2050, because it's going to be hard. It is going to be hard. EV sales are only at 2% in the US right now. And we're talking about scaling up big time. And that's the technology that is ready right now. So I think it's a big task we have in front of us, but I'm very confident that working across agencies and bringing all these technologies together, all the stakeholders, is going to get us there.
Thank you. Our next question is actually for Andrew, and I want to get this, it's a big one before he leaves us in not too long. And Rachael set this up really well. We know transportation electrification is not just light duty vehicles. That might be the technology that is getting the most action right now, but it's buses and trains and all sorts of other forms of transportation. So Andrew, my question for you from the Department of Transportation's perspective, and we have a president who's particularly fond of trains now, what's the role that public transit is going to play in this transition? And not just buses, but trains and rail. And do we see an electrified future for those modes of transportation as well?
Absolutely. I mean, in part of the transportation electrification package, just to be clear, was not just for light duty, but for transit electrification as well, which also solves for some of the equity challenges that Dr. Fine has mentioned, right? So those are critical investments, and we want to do everything that we can to leverage the current low-no program, but to also make sure that we're focused on ZEVs to the greatest extent possible. And that includes, like, to your point, Blair, in the rail sector as well. We want to encourage electric locomotives. We want to encourage rail electrification to every extent possible. And by the way, we also want to encourage our transportation rights of way to be electrified too. And I've seen a lot of the chatter in the chat related to solar and wind. And so I want to let the folks online know about a new departmental policy that we produced just within the past several weeks. So over the course of the past 60 years, we've had essentially a policy that's not necessarily clear with respect to what you can cite in transportation rights of way. And what we said at the Department of Transportation is, let's clarify some of the underbrush to make sure that folks know that renewable energy projects, for example, are allowed in transportation rights of way. So what our guidance does is it says, whether you're at a rest area or whether you're at a Cloverleaf interchange or Diamond interchange, you can cite solar, you can cite wind, you can cite transmission, you can cite broadband, in the rights of way and working with your division office in State Department of Transportation, so that we're not just focused on substantially reducing emissions, which we ought to be and which we are, but that we're also focused on reducing waste. And I think that goes to your question too, right? Like eventually we're going to need distributed energy resources to deal with the demand, both in the rail sector, the transit sector, you know, in our ports, or airports, and on our highways. To deal with this increasing demand, we need distributed energy resources, and we also want those energy resources to be clean too. So we're thinking, you know, about how we deploy EV charging infrastructure today, but we're also thinking about like the best ways of doing so in ensuring that minoritized and disadvantaged communities bear the greatest sources of benefits in that regard.
Thank you. That's great. The you know, another question in addition to, you know, trains, what about fleets? We've seen some things in the news about President Biden going to electrify the government's fleet. And then also, of course, workplaces with the F-150 electric that just launched. You can imagine a lot of people electrifying their fleets. Let's start with you, Andrew. What about fleets and transitioning to electric?
So I think, and I'd love to hear, you know, Dr. Nealer's perspective on this too. I think, you know, when we talk about whole of government, we ought not to just be talking about what the whole of government, you know, at the federal level can be doing, but what our state and local partners can be doing as well. So I think it makes a ton of sense to be looking at aggregated purchasing, and having the federal government lead by example is a critical component of that, right? So having aggregated purchasing so that you're shaving some of the incremental cost off of some of these state and local purchases, I think is something that the federal government can and should be looking at. I think the Department of Transportation, if I'm not mistaken, currently has the cleanest fleet in all of the executive agencies, thanks to, you know, the leadership that we have at DOT in such a wide range of areas. Look, I think the federal fleet has about 650,000 vehicles in it. There was an executive order 13693 that the Obama administration put forward, which I think was at the time the most ambitious executive order in the world with respect to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and electrifying the fleet. That was taken down in the last administration. And my sense is that that this administration is looking at that very carefully and is seeing how we can ramp up electrification, you know, in the federal fleet and helping local and states as well.
Thank you. Phil or Rachel, any comments about fleets? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, can I just add one to that? Just a technical comment is that fleets really have unique opportunities that individual EV owners might not have, right? So if you have a vehicle recharging and you have the flexibility of, you know, keeping one vehicle charging while you're using one, you might not have as much downtime if you need another vehicle to serve the next purpose, right? There's also a lot of opportunities down the line about doing interesting things with managed charging. And we can probably do some managed charging right now with just some smart management of how to charge EVs. But down the line, maybe there's opportunities for bi-directional charging, and fleets really might be the way to seed those ideas and really prove it out in a way that can then make it more ubiquitous for everyone to use. And to me, that will also really build up some of the business models around EV charging as well. So there's, I think, some technical and business model opportunities that for fleets that wouldn't necessarily happen with just everyone owning their own EV.
Phil, anything to add in regard to fleets?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues, and I think fleet conversion is a very good testing ground, governmental fleet conversion, and obviously there's many states and localities who have already have policies of not just all new purchases being zero, but trying to accelerate the turnover of the current fleets to reach certain targets. And, you know, just to put in a plug for California, California's been regulating fleets, not just light duty, but heavy duty for a long, long time. And that approach has proved, as Rachael said, it's a good approach because you have some synergies there. And especially, I think it's going to be really important in the medium duty and heavy duty space. And I'm not sure the federal government has that authority to do that type of fleet regulation, but the states are doing some really good work there. And and again, I'm really looking towards the medium and heavy duty and how we can get those out there, because the trajectory of light duty is promising. I'm sure we'll talk about that going forward.
Absolutely, thank you. And we just, for those who are like, wait, where'd Andrew go? He had to leave us at 12:30 promptly, but if there's questions for him in the chat that we didn't get to, I promise to try to follow up and get some of those answered for you. So we're going to shift now. We've been talking really about transportation electrification as a whole in a lot of ways. We're going to narrow our focus briefly here to specifically light duty vehicles, electric cars. And I think a big question everyone has right now is how quickly do we think America could get to 100% light duty EV sales? As Rachael mentioned earlier, we're at 2. So that's quite a jump. Phil, I think we're going to start with you, given the EPA's role in this. I'm particularly interested in your perspective about setting fuel economy standards and what role that has in helping the U.S. get to 100% EV sales to meet the moment, as we've been saying, that climate change demands.
Yeah, so obviously regulations are a critical part of that, the president has given us some very tight deadlines to get some rescissions of previous rules and new rules in place. I do not work in the Office of Air and Radiation, so I am not actively working on those rules. But I do want to mention that in addition to those regulations, my personal view is that the market may get ahead of what those regulations will even achieve. Essentially, for many applications, electric light duty is a superior product, right? And the question is, people need to be able to afford it and be comfortable with it, with the range and everything. So as technology improves, battery costs come down, eventually you're gonna have, not too far off, you'll have a 500-mile range on a vehicle, which is more than gas vehicles. The volumes of production are gonna go up, the costs are gonna come down. It's gonna be a no-brainer to buy these vehicles. But the trick is the infrastructure. There's a couple other things that have to happen to make that happen. So infrastructure, the charging and in apartment buildings is a big issue that has to be addressed. Fast charging technologies, it can go on and on. But I think the most important work, regulations are important. The most important work is going to be in these other areas, as well as working with industry who's stepped up. The manufacturers have stepped up. And working with the labor unions and getting that sort of general societal acceptance of this, that it's happening. But people will buy a superior product when the price is right.
Absolutely. Rachael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think a really great use of the government role is to make sure that the market is supported by things like EV charging infrastructure, and the president has come out with his 500,000 chargers to be installed. So Andrew and I are working very hard. That's part of the reason why we talk so frequently, is DOE and DOT really working together to figure out what that means and how to place those chargers in areas that are the most optimized, particularly for equity as well. And so I think the infrastructure is absolutely a great role. The other thing, though, is that fleet turnover, and Dr. Fine mentioned it, fleet turnover is pretty, it's a pretty long time, actually. People may not think that, just because they have their car for 3 to 5 years, that,
fleet like 12 to 15.
Yeah, but like average lifetime of a vehicle is 12 to 15 years. So when we're talking about decarbonizing by 2050, I mean, we're talking about then 100% EV sales, technically, whether this can happen or not, but technically it needs to happen in the 2035 to 2040 timeframe. in order for us to hit the full decarbonization by 2050, right? So that's just, we've been thinking a lot about how we get there. Obviously, dropping those battery costs are great, not only because it will reduce the cost to consumers, but like Dr. Fine said, it could really increase the range of vehicles. What's also critically important is the efficiency of those batteries improving. So we are working towards $80 per kilowatt hour is where we really, the ultimate DOE goal to get to in order to have basically an electric vehicle be that no-brainer of, you know, cheaper or same cost of a gasoline vehicle at the sales lot. And then you're saving on the operation costs over time. Not only is the electricity to fuel the vehicle cheaper, well, actually, it's not cheaper, it's more efficient. It's more efficient to drive the EV, so you're using less electricity, but it also is cheaper than driving a gasoline vehicle. We think about 50% cheaper year to year. And the operations costs, you know, there's fewer parts in electric vehicles, so the maintenance is going to be reduced. And so that can also be passed down to the consumer. So really trying to make it as much of a no-brainer as possible. Agree that industry is key here, and we've seen lots of announcements recently. The ones that I think are particularly interesting are the ones like the F-150, where you're getting into a new space with electric vehicles, and not just continuing to produce the compact mid-sized cars and iterating on that. Because right now, over 50% of the new EV sales are those larger SUVs, CUVs, kind of crossover vehicles and pickup trucks. And so if we're talking about not reducing the quality of what consumers want and how they can get around, we need to make sure that there are electrified options in those segments.
That's great, and that, you know, that covers a lot of the next question. You know, industry, the manufacturers do a lot to, you know, they're bringing the product to market. They're trying to make a compelling product. Is there also a role for the public sector to kind of help address some of those rational and emotional issues to get that change in behavior to say, hey, maybe my next car should be electric? What's the role of government there to, you know, helping people along that path to make that decision?
I can take that first. Obviously, there's a role to play on education and outreach, but incentives can go a long way too, and states have been very successful with that, and the federal government as well, of just sort of maybe that early turnover effect. If you can put an incentive out there that might not be available forever, or just making it more affordable. And again, I think there's going to be a critical mass that is hit with consumer acceptance when, I mean, California, I mean, when I'm driving down the freeway, it's not 2%. I mean, it's more. I mean, every other car seems like it's a Tesla. So California has sort of hit the point where there's no stigma. It is acceptable. People want it if they can afford it, but it's not like that across the country. So those examples in some states or some areas that have really sort of ahead of the transition curve could also help other areas come along.
Rachel, any insight there in the public sector's role?
Yeah, I think that's right. Education is important. Just making sure people, you know. So I actually wrote. I used to work for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I wrote a piece on the emissions of an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline vehicle. And even to this day, there are mainstream media reports that electric vehicles emit more than gasoline vehicles. And yes, in some ways, it depends on where you live, where you're getting your electricity. But for the most part, the bottom line is electric vehicles are currently more efficient than just your average gasoline vehicle, sometimes more efficient than hybrid gasoline vehicles. And over that 12 to 15 lifespan of the vehicle, as we decarbonize the grid, it's just going to get better, right? Gasoline vehicles, you purchase it, and then 15 years later, you're actually getting less fuel economy or it's emitting more just from the wear and tear and operation of the vehicle over time. And you're also not getting all the benefits of, better technologies being available. So electric vehicles have this advantage of, being as clean as the grid that charges them, which is a high priority in this administration as well. And in some ways, a little bit of an easier solution, right? Because there are fewer power plants around. And so you can kind of have very specific solutions with maybe fewer stakeholders. But to your point, Stuart, getting people to buy EVs, debunking a lot of those myths is a piece of that. We talk a lot about, especially since we know EVs well, talk a lot about how great it is to not go to the gas station. Like, you don't really think about that until you have an EV and you drive an EV and you're like, oh man, like I haven't stopped and gotten potato chips in a long time.
It's good for your diet too.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's great things to be done with education, but I think really breaking open the market and the availability and just giving people options, bringing down the costs. Those are some of the great things that are coming together, I think, right now that will make this a success.
If I can just add to that, and again, my favorite thing about driving the Bolt was not going to the gas station. I noticed it like on day 2. Debunking the myths is really important. And they're not all myths. Some of it is true, but they're really taken out of context. When people talk about the lithium supply chain and the cobalt supply chain, that is true. But it's not a reason not to go to electric vehicles. It's a reason to uphold labor standards in the supply chain. People talk about the recycling burden of the lithium batteries. That's not a burden, that's a huge opportunity. Mm-hmm. But you hear people, very progressive people, pointing at those excuses all the time as the reason they are not buying an electric vehicle. So there's a ton of work to be done in that area of looking at the bigger picture and just getting people to understand that this is happening one way or the other. And we will work on those other issues, and we need to work on those other issues, immediately.
Yeah, it's an excellent opportunity for increasing transparency in mining, but it's not like petroleum production has zero environmental implications. Yeah. So trade-off is still better. Thank you guys. And I think this next question is going to start with you, Phil, as you touched upon it earlier. We're going to zoom back out from light-duty EVs specifically and talk about how we make sure that this transition to zero emissions mobility is accomplished equitably. You mentioned making it more affordable. One of the concerns that I know we have at Gen 180 is making sure that this transition doesn't exacerbate existing disparities between communities. So what are the things that you're thinking about, that the EPA is thinking about, and Rachel, will get to you as well, about how to make sure that that's not the case and that this is done equitably?
Yeah, so getting the price down, number one, so it's affordable in those communities so they can reap the immediate benefits of not having tailpipe emissions in their communities. I think on the balance, we view it as there will always be a benefit, even to the areas that may not be able to have the deployment as fast as other areas, because moving that technology along is going to allow the heavy duty sector to move faster. The communities next to freeways or in industrial areas with the trucks are going to have a huge improvement in a lower in exposure. So I think on balance, looking holistically, the benefits will be there. But you want the benefits to also be distributed equally. You don't want some communities to wait while other ones are getting the benefits. So I think a big part of that is going to be the secondary market for the EVs. A lot of the initial adopters either have to or have been leasing. And how do we get that secondary market, those prices down? We can incentivize those vehicles. In California, if you were low income at one point, it's not like this anymore, but for several years, basically the incentives added up to the cost of a used Nissan Leaf. So you could essentially get a free Leaf and money to put in a charger. I'm not sure you could do that across the country, or those opportunities will always exist, as that was a unique situation. but it's that secondary and even tertiary market is going to be very important. But there's going to be benefits to those communities, even if the deployment rate is a little bit less because of the initial costs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Rachel, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think infrastructure is another great way to make sure that this is equitably distributed, right? If we allow for the infrastructure network to be built out by private industry, it's likely not going to be equitable, right? Because they're going to prioritize areas that are going to be the highest utilization for charging, and not necessarily where it's needed most even. Think about the highway network, for example. Those are going to likely be low utilization stations, but they're needed when that one person is driving down the highway late at night and, needs a charge, or is planning their trip around national parks and really needs to stop in the national park to see the great views, but also, spend a little time charging as well. So I think charging is a unique opportunity for us for the government specifically to leverage how we actually make this more equitable. And then I think also demonstrations and deployments are really key. They're going to have to start somewhere. And so at least on the DOE side, we go through a very key merit review process when we're selecting projects to fund for either demonstrations or deployments. And one of the things that we have done recently is to add an equity component to that, so that we're actually reviewing the proposals specifically for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's, making sure that the researchers and the companies are working with community members, making sure that they're taking into consideration what the community needs are, propping up the communities, right? So making sure that they have the welcome to apply for these grants. I know it's a little bit of a cycle that we need to spend more time, I think, iterating on and fixing, because a lot of communities, they don't have a lot of resources right now. So even putting in a proposal could be a really big ask. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can, at least partner with communities, if not get them kind of in the pipeline, so that they're benefiting from seeing the process firsthand, but then also potentially being performers and or leads on projects. And making sure that even the teams that are on these proposals are diverse and have different perspectives, so that we can come up with really comprehensive solutions, as opposed to, this is the technology solution, we must implement it here, and then having down the line bigger issues with equity and trying to retroactively build in those perspectives, right? We do it from the start. Hopefully those projects will be more successful, and then also be good for lessons learned for future projects.
Now, if I can just add, another opportunity is it's not all about the vehicle purchase. Ride sharing and vehicle sharing programs have, a lot of good applications in some lower income communities, especially if they could be subsidized to some degree. So I think there's some really good opportunities there. Thank you.
Yeah, well said. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A. We want to make sure and get some of those. A few are around rural communities. How do you, what levers do you pull to try to increase adoption rate or make it easier for people to go electric if they don't live in an urban area or a suburban area? What do we do about rural areas?
Sure, I can take this, this first. I think Phil has mentioned a bunch of these already, right? Incentives play a really key part. The supporting infrastructure, right? You can imagine a DC fast charger, on a rural highway might not serve just the highway, but also the community around it. And that is something that is really a big piece of how we're thinking about the 500,000 chargers that the government is going to install, because we need to make sure that the communities are supported, not just the highway network. And so we've got a very robust framework around that, so that these stations can be utilized for as many opportunities as possible, because that's also how you're going to get higher utilization. So I think that's those two are, I think, two big key pieces, is incentives and the supporting infrastructure, particularly for the role of government.
Anything to add, Phil, about rural?
Yeah, I haven't thought about this too much, but about what the driving patterns are in some rural communities, but my guess is it's very different in different areas. But in some sense, if you're in a small town, if you only live 15 miles outside the small town, I mean, it's a great application for an electric vehicle in terms of you charge it at home, but you probably only need to charge it like once every couple of weeks. So there's if you're more remote, you may be other issues, but I think it just really depends on the community. I don't see it as the challenge there any more or less than in urban areas, other than utilization of some of the infrastructure may be a little less, but I think there's ways to get around that, as Rachel said.
Yep.
That's great. Thank you both. So we have time for 2 more questions. So one of the ones that has really been several people have been asking about in the Q&A, and I think Andrew even started to touch upon it some, that the federal government absolutely has a role to play, but states, localities, we all have a role to play too. So Rachael, we'll start with you, and then Phil, I'd love your perspective as well. The question that I'm going to focus on is, what can advocates be doing, and to prepare states to take advantage, to complement the work that you all are doing, which I think is, what are the things that states need to be ready to step up on in order to help complement the federal agency's work?
Sure. I think, when I talk, just as an example, when I talk about the 500,000 chargers, right, that's not necessarily the federal government coming in and actually installing them ourselves. Right. We need our state and local stakeholders to help us do that, because the only way that we build this out equitably and get the input and feedback that we need in order to place these stations where they need to go is through talking to people that are more on the ground. They're not the people that are sitting in offices in DC, right? Right. Just looking at a map and guessing. So we really need our local and state stakeholders to play a big role in, especially the infrastructure. But I think that's in general. A lot of our grants, for example, at DOE, really rely on us getting connected with the right people. So, I think there's a piece of knowing where to go to look for these things, being ready, like you said, having states and local areas ready to kind of pull things together. I think one of the key things that can be done in advance is building coalitions, building partnerships that make proposals or even just the discussion that's happening more robust, right? So if you have a proposal that comes in that has like lots of different community stakeholders, that's going to be prioritized significantly. And so building those partnerships, looking in maybe places you wouldn't think of before, there are a lot of different opportunities for the electrification market right now. It's new. There might be a lot of business opportunities, pairing with ride sharing, for example, could be something very interesting. Talking to utilities, talking to your clean cities coalitions nearby. All of these things are things that I think can be done in preparation for coming up with ideas and ways that eventually the federal government kind of funds can trickle down to states and localities to make the most efficient projects and deployments as well. And really looking at, I think, some lessons learned from folks that have already started doing it. California is always a good example because they're just so much further along in the electrification market. But look, Oklahoma has some really interesting EV infrastructure lessons learned that really came about because of some local incentives and a new company popping up and sharing, building out some of their infrastructure capabilities. So, I think there's some new things to figure out, but I think there's also a lot of really good case studies that have already happened that we can continue to build on.
Absolutely. Phil, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, most of the federal funding goes to states and local entities to do the work that we're talking about. And I think what Rachael mentioned about sort of the state and local role with utilities is critical, because especially even in California, like that's been one of the toughest nuts to crack on sort of, the different rate structures that can disincentivize, if you're not careful, electric vehicles. But another thing I would mention, and maybe some other states, is, some states or local entities may not be that excited to go, spend a lot of resources on, meeting President Biden's climate goals, but they would be excited about economic development. So there's a lot of opportunities with like revitalization of downtowns and other things where electric vehicles can be a major part of those types of investments. So one idea in communicating to states and cities is that this is part of your economic development plan, which they all have, and it can really make your city more livable, enjoyable, with less noise, less emissions, less soot, less gas stations, less auto repair shops, all those things that, I mean, there's a job transition there, but at the end of the day, you're gonna have a much more livable community.
Thank you. Thank you. In the last minute and a half, last question, so much has been done the first 100 days of the administration. What makes you optimistic about the next 100 days? Rachael, you start, then Phil, and then we'll free everyone up.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, bringing this back to kind of the top line message of the agencies working together, lots of different stakeholders working together. At DOE, we've been thinking about this for quite a while. They're kind of in that first 100 days, there was just this appetite of like, we just really all need to work together to accomplish this. Like, we need to reach out to staff, we need to reach out to other people so that we are, making sure that our resources are leveraged appropriately so that we can be more efficient, so that we can all have kind of like a similar path to get to this decarbon. Because like I said at the beginning, it's a really big goal. It's a really big goal to get to decarbonize transportation by 2050. But I think that the people that I've worked with so far are just so enthusiastic about it, personally, professionally. We really opened up a lot of floodgates for communication to make sure that we're doing the hard work. We're laying the plans now so that we can really hit the milestones to get to a fully successful 2020 or 2050 decarbonization.
That's great. Phil, what are you optimistic about?
Really the enthusiasm, not just at EPA, but across the government, at the career staff level, at the political level, all the way up to the president, who's out there, meeting with Ford. Our administrator was on MSNBC yesterday discussing this. I mean, there's no shortage of desire and drive to make this happen.
That's great. Thank you all so much, Rachael, Phil, Andrew. Really appreciate you guys being here. We just put in the chat, Generation 180's Going Electric Pledge to make your next car electric. So to find out more, go to generation180.org. We'll also post this recording on our YouTube channel. So thanks again so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Right.
Everybody stay safe.
Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.